So I would now like to open the floor to reactions from the people in the panel, and we will also keep an eye open for questions from the public in the YouTube channel. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. If I might take the word, yeah, I find these three really inspiring and interesting presentations, and but I'm particularly interested in the last aspect, because that's something I started to think about too, about energy and the concept of energy, right? The suggestion by John Crowley was to turn energy into a social scientific object, which I think is and also a concept, and I think this is actually very important. But I wonder, what exactly would the concept of energy be then? Because of course we have the physical concept in physics, or also in chemistry, right? And we can say with this aspect, fossil energies or so is an object for the social sciences. I think that would be relatively easy. But I wonder how we can connect it to things like a psychic energy or mental energy or political energy. I mean, because we could ask what we need, or we could say what we need is to muster the political energy to turn the world into a sustainable thing, or sometimes it's about psychic energy. When I find it quite interesting, I think there's a correlation between the psychological problem of burnout, which is a loss of energy, which is certainly not physical energy. It's somehow a loss of psychic, motivational energy, and so the burning out from the inside and the burning up of the atmosphere in global warming. I think they are somehow connected precisely on an energy level. But it's true that in the social sciences we completely lack a corresponding conception of energy. So I wonder whether you have any ideas of where we could go with this, right? Is there? I mean, Randall Collins suggested emotional energy, which is something shared. It's something collective, right? Created in institutions. So maybe this would be a route. But I wonder whether how you think that we can conceptualize energy in a sense which is not just coming from physics.
Do I answer immediately? Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think, first of all, you ask a very good question. And one of the traps we need to avoid here is the trap of being simply analogical. In other words, taking ideas that come from one particular context of talking about energy, electricity, for instance, or oil or gas or whatever, and then assume that you can derive loose analogies from that and apply them to some other field. I think there are some big limits to that, and we need to be careful about it. I would like to, at the same time, stick quite closely to physics, but also recognize that the notion of energy extends beyond what is usually studied in physics. And in that respect, perhaps one of the most useful connections is the connection between energy and work, which is the basis of the physical concept. Energy is, at least in principle, energy that can produce work, though some forms of energy, such as diffuse entropic energy, cannot. And what I was referring to as negentropic processes are precisely processes that use the work of energy to produce processes that create order out of the general entropic tendency for order to decay. And in that respect, references to political or psychic energy, or to the collective energy of action, the kind of thing Hannah Arendt talks about when talking about the specific notion of work in the sense opera, opus, the work of creation, is not simply an analogy of the physical processes. It is the same concept applied to a broader category of energetics, which again connects energy, work, and order in a set of specific ways that can get inspiration and sometimes even modeling from notions of thermodynamics. In the chat, Carlos pointed in a very interesting way to the chaos theory developed by Ilya Prigozhin which is all about this. And we had a brief chat in the chat about the book that Prigozhin and Stengers wrote in the 1980s called Order Out of Chaos, which is about the way in which various kinds of dynamical systems, particularly dynamical systems of an organic nature, can produce forms of order from chaotic models of physical interaction that one would expect to produce only disorder. And I think this is the kind of angle that needs to be followed, an angle that takes the science very seriously, an angle that takes the engineering basis of energy systems seriously, and seeks to extend that understanding of the physics and the engineering to more social questions, taking account of something that is absolutely central in the work of Prigozhin and Stengers, for instance, which is precisely the connection between energy and information. The energy-information nexus being the condition for the organic ordering of potential chaos. Now, I know that's not answering your question, not nearly. It's not answering it conceptually, and it's certainly not answering it methodologically. But it gives at least the spirit in which I believe we should be trying to work, and where I think a lot of very interesting work remains to be done, including in particular to try and imagine what a transition to a lower energy consumption society might look like. What would that actually mean? To change our relation to energy from making it ultimately the core proxy of development. Energy consumption correlates very well with development in the material sense. It correlates very well also with human development. Breaking that correlation raises some very serious conceptual and practical problems that I think constitute a research and action agenda that really deserves our attention. Sorry, that was long-winded and not very precise, but I hope it gives an idea of where I'm coming from and where I'd like to go to.
Thank you very, very much, John, for clarifying that. Any other people who want to? Yes, Lutz? Can you unmute your microphone? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to make a small remark on the contribution of Thilo Wesche in the beginning. He pointed to the property rights of nature, and of course mentioned the famous case I think that everybody knows of the river in New Zealand. But actually, it is not something that is completely foreign also to European traditions. Not necessarily in the field of nature, but there have been similar models, and I would like to mention one in particular. It concerns the World Heritage Site of the Cologne Cathedral, right in the city where I live. This actually, if you look in the property register, this cathedral belongs to itself. And all of the decisions are made on its behalf by a chapter of several hundred people that together try to fulfill the kind of tradition that was built in order when in the 19th century the cathedral was finalized. So actually to have a kind of a stewardship on behalf of a cultural object or a natural object, this can be found in Europe. It can be found in several practices also in dealing with certain natural resources, for example, shared natural resources. There are some areas of Europe where certain forms of transhumance are used concerning shared property rights and shared decisions on its behalf, or something from the south of Germany, the so-called Allmendwiesen, the lawns that are mutually governed also with a certain respect, not really with a property right of nature itself, but this comes close to it. And I would finalize this list of possible examples. I think that there is a huge diversity also, not only in indigenous communities, but also in European, North American societies, of course, all across the globe, that we tend to forget because it's one narrative of property, one narrative of how the world is organized appears to be dominating everything that we are discussing about.
Thank you very much. That indeed refers to also today the emergent landscape of the commons and the sharing economy, and where people are not treating nature as something to use for private ownership or private profit, but something that they govern together. I would like to know what other people want to add to that. How does it affect, for example, how our science and research landscape is organized also around intellectual property, around the assumption that we can use nature as resources for innovation and then bring it to the market. So I think there's a lot of themes in there. Ownership is like a connecting theme that relates to many other things that were said in the morning. So maybe Gary Jacobs would like to reflect on that.
Thank you, Anne. I would actually like to go back to what John was just talking about, if I could, because I thought he's touched on his example of energy and the integration of energy with all aspects of society really brings out something of the complexity we need to deal with when we're talking about social change. Because, I mean, just for want of time, he touched on a few areas: the economic implications, the technological implications, the whole. After the automobile came to the U.S., the entire demography of the country changed. Within 10 years, we changed from being a very urban to a suburban population. Our commerce changed. We ended up going to places by car, rather having to come to them in the centralized place in a city. And I think it's very helpful when we're trying to look at our adaptation to the challenges we face to now ecologically, to how deeply rooted the society is interconnected in every way with a present mode of not only energy, which is only an example, employment, for example. We see what happened with the COVID-19, that suddenly the idea, it's only in the last 100 or 150 years that we've all been going to work somewhere else and then coming back. And we see how deeply entrenched we are in particular ways of working. So I found his perspective very useful in looking more broadly at the problems of social change to see just how integrated every dimension of the society and every walk of life is with all the others.
Thank you very much, Gary. Any other comments on that? Carlos, yes, go ahead.
I wanted to come back to the point of these new approaches to ownership, because let me be a bit provocative, right? This is the right context to be, I hope. And we hear a lot about resilience. You know, the word resilience has become now quite common in the global conversations, especially in the domain of those who are worried about sustainability and the future of humanity. And a provocative finding is that the most resilient societies, the most resilient human societies, are the indigenous ones. You know, they have been there for much longer than our modern industrialized civilization. They have been there for thousands and thousands of years, and generally with conceptualization of ownership, you know, either quite absent or at least very different from our own conceptualization of ownership. And in our own industrial civilization, where the concept of ownership, and in particular private ownership, is, let us say, central, we have these two-sided nature, taking the expression of Hartmut Rosa in the previous session of being powerful at the same time powerless, being extremely effective in transforming many things around us in the material world, and at the same time being extremely effective in destroying the conditions under which human life can continue on Earth. So basically committing suicide, being very effective in committing suicide through climate change, but also many other dimensions. And now we are trying to use one central concept of, or extending one central concept of this self-defeating civilization in order to get out of this dilemma we have ourselves created. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't look at how indigenous civilizations have been dealing with this concept of ownership and common goods and so on, what we call modernly common goods, rather than trying to extending a little bit like, too far away our own concept of ownership. So this is my provocation.
Thank you for that. I think it resonates quite well with what was said in the morning by Mampila also, that we can learn a lot from indigenous wisdom. And it struck me when I heard the story by Tilo Wesche that apparently we need the detour of ownership, giving nature the right to ownership, to sort of like respect nature again. We need to put nature in, see nature as a competitor, and then say, well, the competitor has the same rights as us, before we can let go or limit our own claims to nature, rather than
which is in a way, sorry to interrupt, but which is in a way connected to this idea of the efficiency of our economic processes and efficiency of the markets, which I think is this is the biggest fake news that we deal with. We have been using this concept for decades and generations. While what definition of efficiency could you imagine to use for processes which are so effective in destroying the conditions for our own survival? You cannot use any there is no way to use efficiency to describe that.
I wonder if John Crowley would like to say something about it, because this efficiency logic is also related to the hope of increasing negentropy, keeping the order, stopping the order from destroying all life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some very interesting connections between what Carlos just said, some of the things I was saying, if that doesn't sound too narcissistic, and some of the things that Hartmut Rosa was saying earlier. The idea of control clashes with a much more traditional idea of excess. The idea of efficiency clashes with the symbolic organization of inefficiency, which is characteristic of many traditional cultures. And this is Bataille's point in the passage I was referring to, at a very abstract philosophical level, but still making some interesting points about the energy balance of the earth, because he was not unaware of the science of what he was referring to. The fact that in traditional civilizations, at the risk of caricature, I know, and not all traditional civilizations live in contexts of abundance, but still, one of the most important features of both the cosmology and the cultural practices is the symbolic organization of waste. Doing things that serve no instrumental purpose, destroying things of great value, and doing so because that says something very important about how you relate to yourself as a group and to the cosmos as a setting within which that group lives its existence. The idea of very carefully husbanding resources, as the phrase goes, is an idea that is not universally human. It corresponds to specific social and cultural forms, which have been extensively studied, and the kind of reductio ad absurdum of that is the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The way in which Weber shows, of course, this has been challenged by many who've shown, among other things, that capitalism actually emerged in Catholic Italy before it did in Lutheran Germany. I'm ignoring those issues and just commenting on the way in which Weber himself formulates the idea that you can't have a capitalist economy without an ideology of abstinence, self-sacrifice, and avoidance of waste. And this is connected to many other movements in modernity. Let me just mention another one at the risk of just sort of surfing on all sorts of references. The famous pages in which Michel Foucault describes criminal punishment in pre-revolutionary France are, on his own interpretation, which I think is a perfectly valid interpretation, a demonstration of excess. And he interprets this as the sheer Baroque absurdity of punishment, the 7 pages account, contemporaneous account of a public execution in 1757 that he puts at the beginning of Surveiller et Punir, of discipline and punish, is a demonstration of the fact that a state that controls nothing needs to show spectacularly that at least it can destroy a body, tear it apart, cut it in pieces, burn it, torture it. If we can't control, we will at least do something. And in that respect, I think there's a lot to be got from, first of all, getting out of a purely celebratory perspective on indigenous knowledge, useful though that may be in certain contexts, getting out of a simple binary opposition between the traditional and the modern, or between the indigenous and the civilized, or whatever. There are a million reasons why we should be exiting from that kind of mindset. And using this perspective on waste, excess, and spectacle as contrasted with accumulation, efficiency, and careful husbandry, and looking at the tensions between the two dynamics that exist in our own society as well. We have not completely exited that symbolic world of spectacular excess, but we channeled it into different areas. We've restricted it to certain parts of our moral and symbolic and also financial economy. We have isolated a specific class of people whose function it is to demonstrate ostentatious waste for us so that the rest of us can get on with efficiency. Not completely different from the way the Aztecs or the Mayas or traditional African empires did it, but very different at the same time. Not completely, but significantly different. Again, I'm throwing far too many words into something that lacks concision and precision, but you see where it will be interesting to go with this. How do we manage excess, both materially and symbolically, and what does it say about us? That would be the short headline version.
Well, thank you very much for that. It is very unfortunate that Thilo Wesche could not join us for the discussion, for the debate. He had to leave for due to unforeseen circumstances. Because what John just said is like a totally different approach to how we relate to nature than the ownership as the primary category, and then repairing our destructive relationship with nature by giving nature ownership over itself, which seems like somehow an anthropomorphic detour that we should probably also could skip by not starting from ownership but from access, as you say. So maybe Lutz, would you like to react to that, or see how that relates also maybe to how we deal even with knowledge and with education and with science? The science of nature is also privatized, and which keeps us from reconnecting with each other and with nature.
Well, I was about to make a short comment about what John just said before. I mean, and I completely agree with this. The importance of the symbolic description also of something like an energy system, because something that I found always extremely interesting when observing the last 20 years or 30 years of the energy system transformation that was happening and is still happening here in Germany, to what extent it is really driven by narratives in the very beginning about what is possible and what is not possible, so that the initiators of renewable energies were just decried as fantasts which are not to be taken serious. But that is not the important part. I think an important part in the 90s, early 2000s, that drove the energy transformation, the early energy transformation in Germany, was the connection of energy to decentralization, energy autonomy, and in order to empower people and empower communities. So this kind of liberating narrative was very strongly behind the initial trends. Then, of course, we had the regulation and government support incentive programs, so that the power of that narrative was lost. But then also the energy transformation lost steam, because it lost steam, one of its most important drivers, I think. Nowadays, our government supports very much the big players from the fossil fuel industry again to support the transformation. And of course, they do it in the old kind of way. And we feel a lot of resistance in rural parts of Germany because the kind of narrative is gone. And so it is, I like very much the references to power struggles that John made and all the symbolic dimension of these processes. I think it's absolutely crucial.
Hartmut, want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, to the access dimension and John Crowley's observation, I think, there's a very interesting aspect in the way we live where you can see this, which we can derive from Karl Marx. Marx said the interesting thing about capitalism, capitalist production, is that the moral consumption is faster than the physical consumption. The idea was that we throw out the machines with which we produce textiles, for example, at a pace which is higher than, when they are still good, we could still use them, but they are no longer productive enough. And this is something we now do with kind of everything, right? We throw away our smartphones even though they still work. We throw away the computers even though they still work. We even throw away our clothes even so they are still good, but they are out of fashion. And actually it's true, and we throw away our furniture at home, right? The kitchen and the bed and everything basically, right, is kind of made anew, even though it's still materially good. So that has a lot to do with the energy transfer, I would say. And this is a kind of access dimension because the moral consumption is faster than the physical consumption. So maybe we can think along those lines.
Thiago?
Yes, I would even add some interesting experience I had here in this former GDR. People throwing away Bürger ceramics. So all these objects that were main typical iconographical for this GDR, they are throwing away and we are collecting. I like them very much. People are offering for free, But just two remarks to point what Carlos and also Mr. Möller has said about the property of indigenous, this concept. In many cases, it's not the property over nature, but it is the technology of using these natural resources. The case of the South African musical bow, I had the experience in a meeting there that a participant came and told me, you are not allowed to play our musical bow using, of course, not saying using these overtones, but using this technology because it's our property. And another important thing is the notion of property is not individual; it's always community-based. This is another difference from copyright law here, the Western. And the last thing I would like to address, if we speak about nature and also living heritage in respect to that, the animal rights. This is a new topic coming up, and I'm dealing with this. So animals and cultural heritage, who owns this animal? And this is another thing which we can find among indigenous people, the respect for the animal as another entity, not different or not less valuable than me as a human being. This is another very interesting topic to be discussed.
Okay, and can I?
Pass the word to you, because here I have no visual contact with the
Yeah,
people in
that's
this
it. That's try to yeah. I would like to use the opportunity to have John and Lutz Möller together on the panel in respect of the last session we will have, the roundtable, the discussion of implementation of all the topics we were addressing here and bringing up as potential fields and potential contributions of the humanities and social sciences to sustainability policies. I mean, we were discussing topics that would be real important contribution of the humanities and social sciences to the sustainability policies. But looking at the funding systems, I addressed that already once today, sustainability is under control very much of the natural sciences, especially of the bio-geo section of the natural sciences, and also, and if you come up with a proposition in funding systems for sustainability issues, you are confronted with this hardliner funding ideas. If it doesn't fit in their disciplinary grid, you are out of competition somehow. So what could UNESCO do, for instance, to have an impact on the fundings, on the national funding systems and funding logics, that researchers and engaged people from all different disciplines, not only from the natural sciences, could engage in the fulfillment of the agenda that the UN and UNESCO are setting. I mean, very often on the national level, funding systems are in complete contradiction to the political agenda of UNESCO.
Yes, you're right, Benno, though I think the contradiction also runs through the agenda itself. And this will be an occasion to come back to a comment on some of the things that were said earlier. The 2030 agenda, as it's designed institutionally, is a technocratic top-down agenda with a hierarchy of goals, targets, and indicators, which is supposed to be rolled out. At the same time, the implementation architecture in the real world is incompatible with that vision of the project. And a lot of the difficulties since its adoption, even more than the MDGs, the big difference with the Millennium Agenda was that the Millennium Agenda was limited and focused. It had only 8 goals. It didn't claim to deal with everything. It claimed to be an expression of prioritized concern by the international community. And the idea that when you have prioritized consensual concerns, you can then define a top-down solution, roll it out for limited priority goals, that's not ridiculous. It might or might not be the best way of doing it, but it's not self-contradictory. The SDGs claim to capture everything. And unsurprisingly, you can't capture everything in a top-down technocratic framework. And we know that as an internal planning problem, even within UNESCO. And it's true in every part of the UN system. The fact that we have contradictory requirements with respect to an agenda that is supposedly already sealed as a set of objectives, again, goals, targets, indicators, once and for all, by diplomatic negotiation, and at the same time needs to be owned by everyone concerned with it. And just see it from the perspective of local communities, cities, trades unions, political parties, youth groups, consumer organizations, indigenous peoples, and many other non-state components within the international system, which are not your traditional international NGOs. They would say, why would we simply join this particular party when first we had no opportunity to shape that agenda, and secondly, it would need to be contextualized in a way that would actually call it into question. But we're not allowed to do that. We're supposed simply to implement it. And that's basically what the social debate is. And in that respect, at the risk of going a bit off message and probably sounding very institutionally incorrect, I'm not sure the pandemic shakeup isn't a good opportunity to get rid of some of that baggage. There have been a number of occasions in the past 20 years where the international system has fallen into the trap of adopting these technocratic top-down solutions with no capacity to deliver them. And probably it wouldn't have been desirable anyway to have that capacity. The Kyoto Protocol was probably the first example. The Millennium Agenda followed, and the SDGs were an extension of that. I'd just like to plug the late Steve Rayner's book on the Kyoto Protocol. He called it The Wrong Trousers. I don't know if you've read the book. It was co-authored, but I can't remember who he co-authored it with. If you know your cinema, you know that The Wrong Trousers is a Wallace and Gromit film. It's about literally the wrong trousers. But Rayner's point was that the Kyoto Protocol was imagined on the back of the success of the Montreal Protocol to deal with chlorofluorocarbons, which succeeded, and to a considerable extent also on the back of sulfur dioxide abatement policies earlier in the 1980s, which also succeeded to a considerable extent through techniques that were appropriate for those particular kinds of issues, given real technological substitutability. For a whole series of reasons, that didn't apply to climate change, and as a result, the world lost basically 15 years trying to implement the Kyoto Protocol before realizing it had to do something different. Maybe the pandemic is a wake-up call with respect to the SDGs of the same magnitude and significance as COP15 was for the international climate change agenda. Maybe. Of course, that kind of shake-up isn't always good news because you can lose a lot of valuable stuff when you shake the tree that hard. But at the same time, the agenda as it is not going in the right direction. Again, I'm not trying to be at all politically correct here. And just to comment on the previous discussion, I think one of the key words here is commensurability as a concept and as a set of technologies. I really thank Hartmut for his points about routine excess and waste. I got dragged in my improvised comment earlier into the direction of emphasizing the ostentatious parts of excess in our society compared to other societies. But it's absolutely true that our economic systems are built on routine excess, of which planned obsolescence is just one of the most spectacular manifestations. And one of the challenges we face, and this goes back to the question of whether it makes sense to give rights to nature in the traditional sense of the word rights, is that we're trapped within those ideas of commensurability. If certain things have value, then they must have value on the same scale. And we must be able to trade off those values in reasonable, appropriate, prudent ways. What if things are not commensurable? Mm-hmm. And traditional ideas of excess were all about incommensurability. And this is why, and this is obviously extensively documented, why the Spanish invaders encountered populations, Aztec, later Inca, who literally did not understand a value system in which gold was comparable to other things. The whole point of gold for the pre-Columbian civilizations was its incommensurability. Once you make it commensurable, you change the world. Mm-hmm. In this case, very destructively. How do we build incommensurability back in?
unverfügbar.
Yeah.
For those.
Yeah, I will be very shortly into the question of Benevolent. Shortly, but I have to reply to John before. I don't want to be politically correct here, but in contrast to you, I see a lot of processes that preceded the 2030 agenda in 2014, 2013, where indigenous groups, women groups, youth were fully engaged. So there were participation processes, and I think the way since 2015 has not been as negative as you have judged it. I judge it differently here. I think in our country, a lot of momentum has been generated at a lot of different levels. There are many partners all across our countries who take this agenda very seriously. So it's at the level of cities, at the level of the states, at the level of the government. So there is a lot of momentum. It is translated into concrete action also by different actors. You see most of the companies in the DAX, the German fund, corporate index, stock exchange, they who are organizing their principles around the Agenda 2030, and that improves the quality of their sustainability agendas, even if you can still be very critical. So I'm not that critical as you are. But now coming back to the question of Benevolent, yes, indeed, currently also in our country, when science funding is discussed, it's mostly about the geosciences because they have got chips, they have got the big infrastructures. So there's where a lot of money goes. The funding to interesting social and science and humanities research also in our country is completely negligible in comparison. How can we change that? We have worked working on the basis of the sustainability science guidelines of 2007. We tried to work with the big players in the German research system. There has been some progress, insufficient. We will not stop. It's an uphill battle, which is going to be continued for at least another 5 years, but I see very promising signs there as well.